Welcome to Relevant Revitalization, where you will find out the good, bad, and ugly of church revitalization. You will hear from pastors who have been through the revitalization experience, experts in the field, and much more, all with the goal of equipping, encouraging, and engaging you, your leadership, and your congregation to see God breathe life in your church. Now, let's get into some relevant revitalization.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Relevant Revitalization. I'm your host, Matt Coyne. Today, I am excited to have Dr. Andy Root with me, a professor at Luther Seminary, author of numerous books, including one of my favorites, When Church Stops Working, which, Andy, I must be honest with you, I found this book randomly at Reformation Heritage Bookstore in Grand Rapids, one of my favorite bookstores. I don't know if you know where that's at. But I was in there the one day drinking coffee and I saw it sitting there, and I'm going to be really honest with you. I never heard of the name Andrew Root. So I read it and it hit me pretty hard with my passion and revitalization. I thought there were so many great things in there. So before we get to all that, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks. I guess I need to thank whoever left that book sitting out for you to read. So I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, and looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you could come on. And now, before we do get started, I introduced you a little bit, but I'd love you anything you'd like to tell us about yourself, your family, ministry, passions, hobbies, all that stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm in the Twin Cities, so I live in St. Paul. I tell everybody I live in Minneapolis, but I don't. I live in St. Paul because It only really matters if you live here. Everyone knows where Minneapolis is, and some people kind of know where St. Paul is. But if you live here, it really matters if you live in St. Paul or Minneapolis.
Gotcha.
And that's because Minneapolis people are snooty, and us St. Paul people are salt of the earth. Good, hardworking people. So so I live here in the Twin Cities. Like you said, I teach at Luther Seminary. I have two kids. I have a sophomore in college, which I don't know how that happened, and I have a senior in high school. So, and my wife's a Presbyterian pastor, and I teach at a Lutheran seminary. So, that's me. My biggest hobby, especially as I've gotten older, is something I would have never guessed for myself, which is walking my dog. Like that's my sport. I think we actually say this in the introduction to When Church Stops Working, that like if ESPN televised dog walking, I'd probably watch it. Wow, look at that guy's leash techniques. That's amazing. And how you could listen to a podcast and pick up dog poop at the same time, and keep the dog under control. That would be. That's
some skill.
Yeah, like some people play golf and get tips on golf swings. That's what I could use some tips on.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's I joke that the older I get, I'm like, I can't believe I'm excited over this. Certain things that I find myself getting really excited over.
Yeah, like a quiet house.
Yeah. So, well, I appreciate you sharing a little bit more about you and just your personal life. And as we get started to talk about, as we talk about this topic today, so. There's aspects of your book I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about everything because I want people to read it. I think there's just so many great applicable ideas, and there's so many thought-provoking ideas in your book as well. And I want to start with, I always like to ask authors, what led you to writing this book? So a little of the background, what led you to writing it? And then what was the goal you wanted to get out of it?
Yeah, probably the place to start with this book is the goal, which I've been working on this long series that was supposed to be 3 volumes called Ministry in a Secular Age, which was kind of exploring some of the work of Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher who wrote a book called A Secular Age in 2007, which is really hard and yet really important. And so I've been trying to kind of synthesize isn't the right way to say it, but I've been trying to be kind of inspired by those ideas to put those in the realm of ministry and theology and really ultimately the practice of ministry. So I do have a problem if people have read my other books, like I'm addicted to footnotes and things like that. So those books are really pretty aimed towards people in ministry, but you have to have an MDiv. And what ultimately happened is people liked those books, but then would call me up and say, like, I want to talk to my my leadership committee about this, or my council, and then they would have me Zoom, and they would just be like, tell them all the things about the stuff, because they're just a bit too. I think they got in people's imaginations well, but it was hard to communicate it. So this book, When Church Stops Working, the goal was really to try to synthesize some of that work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a full synthesis of those 3 volumes, which actually ended up being 6 volumes. So you can see that I have problems with brevity. So this was supposed to be like a short, concise. We really hope. I wrote it with a friend of mine named Blair Bertrand. We hope that the ideas were thick and we could pull out the ideas I'd worked on the other books, but that it could be a little bit more direct and in readable, and something that people could pass on to other people in ministry and into lay leaders and things like that. So that's the big idea. But where that whole project is born out of is really trying to think about the real issue with, I think, Protestantism at this moment is not necessarily the decline of membership and the decline of resources or institutional vitality, but it's really, how do we talk about a living God again? Like that becomes the real issue. So that's really the core of the whole project, and this book is right within that of, how do we think about the church as a place that can speak of a living God again? How do we even live lives at this moment in this late modern time where we can be shaped by imaginations of a living God, and particularly how do ministers and leaders kind of frame what they do that way?
As I've already said, I think it's a must read for anybody in leadership, but I do like how you say it synthesizes that. I haven't read all the faith formation, but especially faith formation in the secular world. I think there's so much there. So that, let me ask you, that was kind of your softball question. In the beginning of the book, well, maybe this probably all is because it's based off of your book, but in the beginning of the book, you mention, why churches have problems, and you say it stems from the secular age infecting the church. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's really common that, and even something that I think we have a larger consensus about, that people would say, oh yeah, all Protestant denominations, all Christianity in America, maybe in the West, is dealing with secular forces. There's secular headwinds everywhere that maybe we didn't deal with 30 years ago, or surely 100 years ago, or something like that. But secular is this weird kind of word where you feel like you know what it is, but as soon as you start to try to dissect it a little bit, or even explain its coherence in any way, and all of a sudden it becomes quite slippery. And so I think how we tend to view the secular, or what it means to live in a secular age, is as the loss, as decline, as the loss of people going to church, for just the most direct definition. That we used to have hundreds of members. Now we have a lot less than that, and I actually think that's true. There's no way you can deny that. And that has huge implications. But what it actually means to live in a secular age is to have belief itself become quite fragilized. And so we live in a time where we're very aware we could believe something else. And the whole conditions of belief become reworked and reimagined. And that we live in a time where people can say statements that seem coherent or seem to make sense. Like, you could overhear somebody in a coffee shop, maybe not in the Christian bookstore coffee shop you were at, but in any other coffee shop where you could hear someone say, or maybe in that Christian bookstore where somebody could say, I was just in a church. It got pretty toxic. I just have decided I need to take a break from God for a while. Like, I just need a break from God for a while, and then I'll figure out what's next. And you could overhear that person and go, oh yeah, I get that, or that makes sense, or whatever. Where people in a different era, a different historical moment, would have heard that statement, and it would have made no coherent sense whatsoever. I mean, it would have been like saying you're going to take a break from breathing for a while. Like, it's just that just wasn't possible. But now we live in a time where belief in any kind of transcendent reality feels really optional. And even if you want to be a spiritual person, which most people, I think, across our cultural context, and oddly, most middle-class people really want to be spiritual. But that spirituality doesn't have to be based in any larger belief structures, like any sense of a creed or any sense of a historical perspective, or really any kind of philosophical metaphysic. Or, I mean, it doesn't have to be in anything other than your own subjective feeling. And in some ways, classic forms, say, of organized religion or Christianity are weighed the same as some YouTube channel. Like if you want to follow a YouTube specialist on aliens, that can become your spirituality, or some new diet or some new exercise method that seems to hold just as much kind of ritualized significance and spirituality to it as, taking communion or hearing the word preached. And so you can see how the whole conditions of belief change in a significant way.
Yeah, it's interesting. On Sunday nights, I'm going through what I'm calling Bible 101. And this past week, I talked about how our culture, we take the pre-understanding into reading scripture, and how that really gets in the way of when we fill the blanks in with our culture or our society or what we think America, that's how we come up with America Jesus and all this other stuff.
Yeah, right.
And so I like that. I think what I hear you saying is, that's not just true within scripture. That's just true in our whole Christian life. We allow the secular age to really dictate who we are, if we're not careful.
Yeah, like in that sense, we're all secular in a certain way. Like it's in some sense impossible for us not to be secular, and yet there's problems. I mean, that's not to say that's great, but this is just kind of the air we breathe. That it's part of the structural reality. So yeah, I mean, this gets a little bit obscure, but this is the kind of point Charles Taylor makes, is that the way we see our lives is through a frame of immanence. And so where if you went back to the medieval period, people saw their lives, for better or for worse, through a supernatural frame, and we see ours through a quite natural frame. So it takes us a lot more a kind of imaginative work to imagine or to live into there being a living, speaking God who is moving history in a certain direction. Like the kind of unthought currents of that will take you away from that, not towards it. And that's really what it means to live in a secular age, that you actually have to swim against the stream to think, okay, there's a God who speaks in the world and is moving history in a certain direction. And you can not think that and have it just be overtaken. You have to do a lot of work to swim against that current.
That's good. Yeah. I'm kind of jumping around here in this interview. Yeah. So another topic that I really enjoyed, so it's kind of me being selfish. There's some things I wanted to hear you talk about was.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
One of my favorite chapters is chapter 2, when you talk about busy people, busy church. And this chapter, I found myself reading a couple times because you focus on this waiting. And I'm going to get in just a few moments why I'm asking about this. So you say waiting is practiced by the disciples and advocated by us is not inactive. It is responsive. Can you expound on that and why you advocate for following or for waiting for the Lord to act and we respond?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it really starts with the fact that, this is maybe why you like the chapter or at least want to discuss it, is there's a certain way that we're formed, I think, in this time we're in to hate waiting. Like waiting's the worst thing. You know what I mean? Like in many ways, a lot of Silicon Valley innovations are trying to, make things seamless and, take all the kind of rubs out of our lives and, just make things quite easy. And waiting becomes one, so Amazon tries to speed up the time it can get you what you want. And there's a social theorist, a Polish social theorist named Zygmunt Bauman, who says part of the modern project is to take all waiting out of wanting, so you want something and you get it immediately. So at that level, we all become kind of Homer Simpson, like I just remember from like season 3 of The Simpsons, which just shows you how old I am. Homer waiting for dinner and saying to Marge, "When's dinner going to be ready?" And she points to the microwave and says, 12 seconds. And Homer's like, "Oh my gosh, why do I have to wait so long?" And that's something deep within us. So to tell people that there's a faithfulness in waiting is really goes against the grain of our larger society, and it feels like a waste. We're kind of told that waiting is wasting, and yet when you do look at the biblical text, like one of the pitches we try to make in this chapter is that where the church really starts is in the command to wait. Mm-hmm. Like we want to think of the church's birth in Acts 2, which, in a real way it is, but the church is only gathered to have the Pentecost experience because at the end of Luke and into Acts 1, the men on the road to Emmaus, after they have an encounter with Jesus, are told to go back to Jerusalem and wait. Like that's the command they're given. Go to Jerusalem and wait. And so there is something I think really important about us waiting in this moment. And we do, this is very Protestant in a certain sense that, both Calvin and Luther thought they knew how God acted, and God acted as word. And so there's this kind of a dialogue that happens, and there's something dialogical that happens. And to be in a good conversation, and maybe we've lost this in our kind of mediated social media world and our digital world, but to be in a conversation, you have to wait and receive as much as you speak, so the movement of speaking is always, it always has this assumption that you're going to wait to hear a word. It's a terrible conversation if someone is just waiting for you to shut up so they can say their piece. We've all had those kind of conversations where this person isn't listening to you. They're just kind of watching your lips to wait till you stop so then they can say their piece. And there's something very unfaithful to the humanity of another person in that conversation. And if God is one who invites us to hear God's word, then there is a sense of waiting becomes essential, but it is waiting for something. Yeah. It is really true to wait for nothing or to wait for like a software update. It's awful. Like, that's not a good form of waiting, but to wait for your child to be able to express their deepest thought, or wait for someone you love to gather themselves to be able to tell of their experience or their love for you. Like those are holy, sacred forms of waiting, and often make the relationship. And so that's what we're getting at, because in this moment, there's just this hyper concern of decline, and that leads to a certain hyperactivity. Mm-hmm. And yet, I don't know, like both Blair and I are pretty uber Protestants, and there's something that what renews, what saves is the word. And the word does demand a kind of confession that human action disconnected from God's own action cannot save itself. Yeah. And so what the human being does is first surrender to a state of waiting for God to speak to us. And that is uncontrollable. And that's why we hate it, because part of the modern project is to control everything. Mm-hmm. And at one level, especially as middle-class people, are control freaks. And we want to control every piece of this. And we want to control decline. And yet God is uncontrollable. Yeah. And part of our issue is we've kind of thought that, well, we think the church is an elderly parent who can't take care of itself anymore. So it needs us to do things for it. And then that leads us to think God is in a certain kind of odd way. So we lose the sense that God being the God who is God and acts. And if this God is God, this God doesn't need our actions, but maybe will call us in to act. But the only way we'll know that is by waiting. Mm. And, prayer itself is a waiting in the presence of God. And I think this in many ways is what Paul means when he says to pray without ceasing, is to continue to wait in the presence of God. Yeah. And even your own action is a kind of waiting to be led by the Spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to get to a practical question in just a moment, but I want to focus on this waiting. And I know that this isn't the main purpose of you writing this part of the book, but it had me thinking as I was yesterday morning teaching a group of adults about, we're going through this book about technology and how we can better, raise our kids in a world that's filled with just crazy technology, how we can use it for the good. But anyways, we're in the part where we're talking about Sabbath, about truly resting in the word, the true Hebrew word for Sabbath. And we're not talking about leisure. We're not talking about rest as we know it. And again, I know this isn't your main goal, but it really started convicting me as I'm getting ready to talk to you about this, that the church really has failed at resting in the Lord. That, busy people, busy church, and that's do. It's become almost this badge of honor. How's life? Keeping busy. It's become this badge of honor. So it's not really a question, I guess. It's just like, what do you think about that? That idea of the church really failing on that idea of resting in the Lord.
Well, it's an interesting paradox, because you could imagine that really busy people would want a kind of church experience that was slow, that was contemplative, because they're just so busy all the time. And yet there's this odd kind of reality that's very rare. Like, you know what I mean? Like, contemplative experiences rarely are filled with hedge fund managers from Wall Street. Well, for probably multiple reasons, but like, busy people tend to want to go to a busy church, and that, I think, that's a really fascinating reality. And I think it unmasks the fact that we tend to think of busyness as a moral reality. In other words, like, when you think of your life and what makes your life good, or the shape of a good life, and therefore the shape of a good church, you think busyness. Like, when, to your point, when people ask me how I'm doing, I say busy, and I'm both communicating a bit like, don't give me anything more to do. You know what I mean? Like, don't do it. Let's not do anything more. But I also am communicating and telling you that I got a lot going on, that I got reach, that I got places to be, that that I'm successful because I'm busy. And I think churches end up feeling that way. And there's just an odd kind of dynamic to that a good church is a really busy church. And it shows that we think that a good life is a busy life. And so our moral horizon is being busy. And yet we also are very aware. When people ask me how I'm doing, I say busy with a sigh, because I also am kind of communicating that I can see a future here that's not too distant, that I could get really burnt out. Like, that I could things could all come undone. And I don't know if I can keep up this pace. Like, I know that too. And this is a major danger, I think. And it's no wonder then that we have a hard time hearing God speak or recognizing transcendence within our world, because we're often just too busy to notice. And so the point of waiting isn't just a kind of push for some kind of level of pietism or something like that. It's really trying to be attentive, have an attentiveness to this. And just making a wager that an attentiveness to God speaking and acting will renew us more than finding ways to optimize our action and get more out of less, which is really what kind of late modern forms of innovation, I hate to say it, are tend to be about, is how to optimize action to get more actions inside your unit of time, which is why you feel so busy. That's the strange thing about even breakthroughs as benign as like email doesn't save you any time. It creates conditions for you to have to do more correspondence than you would have if email didn't exist. Like, before email, you maybe had to write 5 or 6 letters a day or maybe a week. And now, you should be able to do correspondence much more quickly. But the problem is that email creates the conditions not for you to get 5 or 6 correspondence you have to do a day, but to get 50 emails or 60 emails or 70 emails. So it creates more reach and more possibility, which we like, but it also demands more output of energy to attend to it. And then you just get exhausted. You just get absolutely exhausted. So there's just no doubt that the Bible's filled with, like Jesus at the end of Matthew asking the disciples to wait with him, and they can't. And then, in the midst of not being able to, Peter starts, when they come to arrest Jesus, starts wielding his sword and cutting off ears. And I think, to take this analogy too far, Protestant leaders would feel a little bit more comfortable wielding swords and cutting off ears than waiting with Jesus in sorrow, and waiting in the dark night. And so, and we have, be still and know I am God. Like, one way you can render that in Hebrew is put down your hands and know I am God. Stop trying to do stuff. And that's where the title of the book comes from too, is, when the church stops working is obviously a sense of the church isn't working well, but it's also when it's not working, we try to do more. And the church needs to stop working so hard maybe and turn to really support each other, minister to the world, minister to one another, and wait on God. And that just may renew us.
Yeah, that's so good. I asked that, not provoking any answer, but I'm so glad you answered it the way you did, because I think that is great encouragement and a challenge for pastors, ministry leaders. I think it's a great encouragement for our church. But like I said, I want to get practical here because, my experience with church revitalization, I journey alongside churches that I always use the number 30. I don't know why. It's an arbitrary number, but that's about a church of 30 is probably the average of who I work with. And so my question is, a few episodes ago, I was talking with someone about not pressing the pause, but the reset. And because so many pastors, when they get into that season, they just pause because it's what my wife and I call stress paralyzed. There's so much to do. We don't know what to do. What does that look like? So I guess my question for you is, how do we balance waiting on the Lord, but understanding that we do have to do something in a church of 30 that's about to close its doors? What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that you're, from my perspective, you're absolutely right that we should never. And I would be really scared about people reading my work this way, is that somehow I flippantly don't think like being able to balance a budget or, deal with money or the responsibility of people you've hired and them having health insurance doesn't weigh on you, or that you should somehow escape into some kind of pietous place where you don't care about those things. Those things really matter. Like you're saying, most churches are about 30 people, and most churches, even more churches, the larger churches, are one roof leak away from being done. Like one unknown roof leak and a bill for $800,000 or something would put a church under in most churches in this country. So I don't think we should ever overlook the heaviness of those realities. Like those are really significant realities. And to wait, for me, then, it doesn't just mean doing nothing. And like I said, a waiting where I had this experience in an Apple store where I got a new watch, and then they asked me if I wanted to pair it while I was in the store. And I figured, well, that will take something off my to-do list. And then, of course, as soon as they tried to pair it, they had to do a software update on it. And it was like a Sunday, and the Wi-Fi was, like the bandwidth was all eaten up. And it took forever. And then I was like 20% into it, and I was like, I can't leave now. But I just had to watch each percentage point go like every couple minutes. And it was the worst. Like no one wants to wait like that. And I was essentially waiting for nothing, nothing dynamically narratival, if you will. There's no story in waiting for a software update other than I want to get out of here. Like it becomes completely kind of instrumentalized. And so we have to wait with something. And so the leadership demand on a pastor of 30 is helping their people wait for something, helping them wait with a story. And this is why we said with a watchword, with a kind of framework to think about how God is acting in the world. What we're waiting for isn't nothing, or we're not waiting for miraculously a check to come that will solve our budget issues. We're actually waiting on the Spirit of God to move. We're waiting on Jesus Christ to come and minister to us. And that is happening. And so part of what you do when you wait is there is an action of what it means to tell our stories. And particularly, and this is where probably my own theological perspective comes in, is that God really moves. I mean, this is the wager I'm making that goes from, Luther to Kierkegaard to Blaise Pascal to others, that God particularly moves out of death and suffering. And so we can be attentive that when there are experiences of people confessing loss, brokenness, just a sense of feeling like they're up against some kind of death with a capital D or a lowercase d, that this becomes a very environment where this God of Jesus Christ moves, this God of Israel that takes what is dead and makes it alive. And so there's a sense in that what we're doing when we wait is hearing each other's story of loss and brokenness and sharing those stories, which becomes a way of ministering to each other. And it's in those sharing those stories of being ministered to one to another that I think we start to recognize God's action, that God is actually moving in the midst of this.
Yeah.
But if we can't get to this kind of passive place of receiving and giving, then we miss that. And so there is a lot we're doing when we're waiting. We're sharing deeply in each other's lives by telling stories. The relational dynamic is really important. So part of, a church of 30, there's something really beautiful about it.
Yeah.
I think if it's about a kind of accelerating growth, then a church of 30 just simply, it feels like, does not have the resources available to get off the mat and to grow on top of growth.
Yeah.
They're like the opposite of too big to fail. It's like they're too small to ever succeed. But that's a certain dynamic, a certain read. And I want to say what makes a church good. Like they're just too small to ever be busy, to attract busy people. There won't be enough programming. There won't be enough going on to get busy people to come. But I do think that those 30 people can share deeply in each other's lives, and that will renew. They can have the kind of relationships that aren't based on instrumentality and what we're getting out of this, but what it means to bear each other's burdens and share in Jesus Christ. They can be a community that prays together. And that actually is a lot going on. There's a lot of actions inside of that, but it is really being in a stance of what it means to receive each other and what it means to receive God as we do receive each other. I mean, it's fascinating that both baptism and the Lord's Supper, communion, are passive acts of receiving something. And we say throughout Protestantism that in different ways, we say it within different traditions, but that this is the presence of Jesus Christ, that this is the presence of Jesus Christ before us. And that always happens in community. Even if you had to do it over Zoom during the pandemic, there was a sense of seeing other people, of taking with other people. And so I think there's actually a lot that goes on with churches of 30, and there should be I don't think we should have any shame of being that small. I think there's actually a gift there. Doesn't take away the vulnerability. The vulnerability and fragility is there. But actually, big churches are quite vulnerable and fragile too.
Yeah.
They just seem to be able to hide behind their budgets or whatever. We're all pretty fragile. And there's just something beautiful. I'd like to flip the script a little bit and say, instead of feeling like at 30 you're kind of screwed and maybe you can figure this out, maybe you can't, I'd like to actually say, if you're at 30, you have a real advantage here, that you have the conditions are there for you just to really be in each other's lives and pray for one another and minister to one another and know one another, and that you're gonna have to actually do more work if you have 500 people in your church or 300 people in your church or 5,000 people in your church. You got to do a lot more work structurally to think about how do you help people share in each other's lives. And in many ways, you're trying to get down to groups of 30 so people can really be with each other and hear each other's stories and have what we call resonant experiences where you feel spoken to and heard. And so I think there's an advantage there. So I don't want people to see waiting as doing nothing. It's actually doing something significant. It's opening our lives up to one another and to God.
Yeah. And I will say, for the listener, read the book, because you'll see that waiting isn't just sitting here twiddling our thumbs. When we first came to our church here, for about the first year, I stopped all programming. We had about 50 at the church, and I just stopped and I focused just on us, on the unresolved conflict, on discipleship, on growing the Lord, praying together, honestly, crying together, laughing together. And what we found is what you said. So I can be a case study of Rollins Church in Manton, Michigan. That's what we did. And God breathed new life into this church. One of my favorite representations of God breathing new life is Ezekiel 37. And though we weren't dead, dry bones, we were well on our way. And so I think that we waited in the Lord and waited. I had a vision. I was ready and raring to go when I got here, but I felt the Holy Spirit saying, just pause, just wait. Don't wait on ministry, wait on this idea. And so I just want to echo what you've said. I think when we move faster than the Lord, obviously, if we're faithful, he's going to slow us down, and vice versa. Sometimes he moves faster faster than us, and we got to keep up with them. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
yeah.
Well, Andy, I appreciate you so much being on here. Just such great wisdom and insight. And I love how, like I said, how this really pertains to so much of revitalization. And I always like to ask everybody who's on, before you head out, do you have any parting encouragement or advice or just some comfort for our pastors who are listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think my encouragement really would be that in some sense, there's a paradox here. In some sense, you have what you need. That you have this sense of relationality, you have these stories, you have the ability to stop and to pray. And at another level, you'll never have what you need. And what I mean by that is that this is all ultimately dependent on the act of God, and God is faithful. And so I think my biggest encouragement is that the church doesn't need you to save it. And Christianity doesn't need you to protect it in this moment, that God will be faithful to it. And that to just take great heart in the gospel, that the gospel is the great gift that we're given. And I know these are hard times. These are really, really hard times. These will never go down as like the golden era of American Protestantism or, Protestantism. These are going to be tough times. But there have been a lot tougher times. I sometimes tell my students, this is not ninth century England. There are no Viking raiders going through our churches. So the church has seen itself through more difficult times than these. But the gospel remains utterly beautiful and worth giving your life to. And Jesus Christ acts and moves. And so if the point of this is to somehow build something and, see success in numbers or something, it could be really painful. But what the gift is, what the blessing is that you get to give your life to this incredible story and yearn for the presence and have the encounter with this living God. And that's quite a remarkable thing to contemplate and help a community think about how the God of Israel takes dry bones and makes them live. How those dry bones of Jesus in the grave live and now give us all life and minister life to us is a beautiful, beautiful thing to give our lives to.
Well, thank you for that. That's great encouragement. And so that right there would have been enough. And so thank you for that. And again, just one more time, thanks for being on as we head out. Andrew, Andy, do you have any, do you have a blog or anything? I guess I should have asked you that, that anybody could follow, any articles, anything?
Yeah. Well, I don't have a blog, but you can find my website. It's just andrewroot.org, and there's stuff on that. Like, after this interview, we'll go up there when you post it and send it to me. But I also do have a podcast that's called When Church Stops Working. That we're trying to do 2 episodes a month, and we're sometimes really good at that, other times not. But that would be a place where people could find me.
Great.
And
awesome.
So,
well,
wonderful.
As you head out, our listeners know that I like to give away resources because of my good friend Ryan over at Church Merch. So today I want to give away 2 copies of When Church Stops Working and also 2 copies of Faith Formation in the Secular Age. So if you're new to the show, in the show notes, you see text me. Just text me in the first, I'll give away 1 of each. So first 4 people who text me, I'll get a copy of these books out to you. So Andy, again, thanks for being on. It was great having you.
Thanks, Matt. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, this is Relevant Revitalization, and we'll see you next week.